This is a story, in a strange way, about visitors from heaven. And it goes back to a time in my life when my wife, June, was still alive, and we were missionaries down in Honduras. And if you could imagine, we were struggling to learn the language. We were new in the neighborhood, and one of our neighbors came over. Now, we lived in concrete pillbox houses. They were not very many rooms, concrete walls, concrete ceiling, concrete floor. It just trapped all the sound when the buses would go by. We knew all of the buses by their different diesel sounds that they'd be making because the sound would just come in and get all over us. And into this environment, which in our side was absolutely devoid of anything except a few sticks of furniture and a couple of suitcases that we'd been living in for a couple of weeks at the most. Into this came our neighbor from next door. Now, he was dressed up like a typical Honduran. He was just layered in clothing from top to bottom, whereas Americans will dress down and get in shorts and T-shirts for hot weather. Hondurans typically tend to dress up, so he had on a vest, and he had on a long-sleeve shirt, and he had on a jacket. Seemed like he had a sweater. Maybe it was a sweater vest that he had on, and long pants. And we're sitting there trying to talk to him in Spanish, and we're delighted that he's there. And then we began to notice, much to our horror, that he had little German roaches crawling all over him. Now, if you're not from the South, you may not be familiar of the United States. You might not be familiar with roaches and what they do to certain people. But we had grown up with big black roaches. They're the kind that come in from outside. And indeed, where we were stationed in Tegucigalpa, there was legions. A river, a black tide would come out of the sewer whenever it rained. So we were very familiar with the ones that came in from the outside, but we had not seen the German roaches, which are the little brown ones that live inside. We hadn't seen them. They had been banished from our house in America, and they certainly weren't in our house in Honduras, but right next to us is living a fellow that came over with these roaches crawling all over. Now, that meant nothing to him. But it meant the world to us. My wife, June, at the time, she could not abide a roach. And so I'm thinking, what can I do? And I didn't particularly like him either. And so I'm praying, and I'm saying, God, help him to become aware. Because he had a half a dozen or more running around on him. And suddenly, and in a few moments, sure enough, the Lord made him aware. He noticed one. And he just looked at it casually, and he noticed it. And I thought, oh, that's great. Now he'll be on to the rest of them. And what he did was he just flicked it off and went back into his conversation. And because we're trying to make friends and trying to meet him as he is and all of that, our eyes are riveted on him. And I'm trying to do nothing, but I'm noticing in the corner of my eye where that roach is going. And he's not even trying to kill it. He's not trying to step on it. It's all I could do to restrain my foot from going in that direction. And I just tried to take note where he was going to hide so I could go after him later. Now, we just sat there in amazement. It didn't seem to matter to him. He didn't look for the rest of them. It didn't bother him a bit that he'd had one. Do you know that we would have been beside ourselves if we'd found a roach on us? And that's another story that happened. And maybe we shouldn't be so squeamish. But what is happening here? We've got two cultures. And in one culture, we've come, let's say, in the south of the United States, we've reached a point in time where we're able to banish almost all insects from our house so that we live unmolested on the inside. Even the writer of Solomon's in Proverbs talks about how lizards get into the courts of kings. You couldn't keep insects out in the old days. And indeed, throughout the long history of our races, there's never been a time until now when insects could maybe have been kept out of the house. People used to sleep with their animals, many people would, under the same roof for protection of them. And so we have this fellow who's living next to us. His household must have these German roaches as a common, ordinary part of life, and they don't think anything more of it than 100 years ago people would have thought about flies in the house. And so it's what you grow up with and what you get accustomed to that you make a place for in your life, and you don't think anything strange about it. Now, what does this have to do with visitors from heaven? Well, I got to thinking about it recently in terms of what we teach at Healing Streams. We're always seeking to help people to learn how to come out of their negative emotions. Because the negative emotions are the real nasty pests that come in and they displace the peace and the confidence that's meant to be in our hearts, the flow of love that could be there and the simple joys of life. But stuff happens and negative emotions grab us. And we live dressed up in negative emotions much of the time. And I got to think, well, what would it be like? It just seems ordinary to us, right? But what would it be like if people came down from heaven and visited us, and they've been living up there? Maybe people we know that have gone on, and they've been living up there entirely negative emotion free. They've been living dressed up, free and clear of these things, and such as anger or bitterness or fear or anxiety or worry or depression or feelings of rejection or any of these kinds of things. And they're just used to the flow of peace and grace and joy. And now all of a sudden they're back in our bodies, and their body is just crawling around with these little insects like negative emotions on them. They're going like, how can you stand it? How can you stand living with these things on you? Well, that's, my friends, is what it's like when we don't learn how to put off what the Bible calls the old man, the life of those negative emotions upon us, and do what Paul says in the book of Romans in chapter 13, verse 14. He says, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh. Make no provision for negative emotions to stay on you. Don't just flick them off. Crush them and live in that peace and joy. How do you do that? Come to our website, healingstreamsusa.org, and see the material that we have there that would help you. See the information we have there that's meant to help you learn how to live in greater peace and freedom.